Today in our 2016 Nissan Titan, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install the Air Lift Loadlifter 5000 air helper springs for the rear axle. It's going to be part number AL88229. Now to help us with our installation, we're going to be using the Air Lift spring spacers for the Loadlifter air helper springs, part number AL52420. Here's what our airbags look like once we have them installed. And these are going to give us that extra support we need whenever we're hauling a heavy trailer or a heavy load. We're going to be able to adjust these from 5 all the way up to 100 psi, and they're going to give us up to 5,000 pounds of load leveling support. Just keep in mind they're not going to increase the payload of our truck, they're just there to help support the extra weight. What's really nice about these bags is they're going to have an internal jounce bumper. So if we have too little bit of air inside or something going to happen where we lose the air, it's going to prevent our truck from bottoming out until we can get more air in the bags. All the mounting brackets and hardware are going to be included, and we're not going to have to drill or cut anything to get them in place. Now I do want to mention that we have a spacer here that is sold separately because our truck is lifted, so we had to make up for the extra height. Each spring is going to work independently from each other, so that way we can help compensate for those off-center loads. Our bags are going to come with 2 inflation valves, so we can manually inflate them and control how much air is in each one. Now there is a compressor kit sold separately, and you can add those in so you can add air or remove it without ever having to get out of your truck. Now a common problem whenever you're towing something heavy like our fifth wheel here is that you get a lot of sag. Well, we have our fifth wheel hooked up, but all the weight's off of it right now, so we can take a quick measurement. If we measure about the center of the wheel well arch at the back here, we're right about 42.5 inches. But if we go ahead and drop the landing gear and let the weight of our fifth wheel come down, you'll see that the truck is going to start to sag. And now with the full weight of our fifth wheel on our truck, we can see that it brought it down quite a bit. It actually dropped it to right about 40 inches. So that's going to be a 2.5 inch difference. It's going to put a lot of stress on our rear suspension and actually possibly pull the front end up, which is going to misalign our headlights and put less contact from the tires on the ground. So with our fifth wheel hooked up, we're going to take our truck for a quick spin and see how it handles. So as I'm driving through our test course and I go over the speed bumps, I can definitely tell you it's a very jarring effect and it's really resonating through the seat. Each bump I hit, you can really tell how much stress is being put on the back end. And as I'm going through the slalom, of course I'm not going that fast because I have a camper behind me, but it really doesn't want to respond as quickly as it should. It just feels kind of mushy going in and out of the turns. Now we have our trailer hooked back up with all the weight down on the truck, right about 42.5 inches, and it only took about 50 psi. So with our truck being level, we're going to be able to tow our camper and not have to worry about so much stress on the rear suspension or the front, and the tires are going to wear more evenly because they're going to be right where they should be. So now that we have our airbags installed, let's take our truck and camper out on the test course again and see how it handles. Now with our airbags installed, I can immediately tell a difference going over the bumps. You can still tell that they're there, but they're a lot less harsh on your back and it's not as noticeable coming through the seat. And as we come through our slalom course, again, not going that fast because I have the camper behind me, but it feels a lot more stable and it's responding a lot more quickly. It's not so mushy going in and out of the turns. It's a lot more crisp of a feeling. We already have our passenger side airbag installed, but we'll go ahead and put the driver's side in together. So if we move over to the driver's side frame rail, right behind this cross member towards the back, behind the fuel tank, we're going to have this electrical line that's going to be attached to the frame using these plastic clips. We're going to want to pull these away so that the wire will be loose from the frame. So you just take a flathead screwdriver or a trim panel tool and you're going to pry those plastic clips so they come out of the frame, and that electrical cable will be free to move around. Now if we come to the outside of the frame, inside the wheel well area here, we're going to have our fifth wheel mounting brackets. We're going to have a bolt that's going to be towards the very back of our truck going into the side of the frame. We're going to need to remove that, so you're going to want to grab a 19mm socket and we can pull it out. Now we're not going to be reinstalling this bolt, we're going to have a replacement in our kit. Now if we come back to the driver's side rear axle here, we're going to have our brake lines going into this plate that's welded to the axle. Now it's going to have this little cover. We can just kind of slightly bend it up just a little bit so we can get access to the very far left bolt holding that brake line in. We'll grab a 12mm socket and we're going to loosen that up just enough so that we can move the fitting inside. Now we're going to want to rotate this counterclockwise. That's not going to move a whole lot because there is those tabs in there to stop, but we want to move it as far as we can, and then we're going to tighten that bolt back up. And we may find that we have to adjust it a little bit more, but we can come to that after we get everything else in place. And it is going to be easiest to use an open-ended wrench to loosen and tighten this bolt up because of that plate on top. Right by where we removed those plastic clips from the frame from our electrical line, we're going to have a large hole in the side, on the inside of the frame. We're going to want to grab our J-hook. It's going to have a threaded end. It's going to be somewhat of the smaller one. We're going to take the hook, and we're going to put it in the frame and just let it hang there for right now. Then if we move just a little bit forward, we're going to have this round cross tube. We're going to grab our clamp. It's going to be a U shape. We're going to go over the cross member and we're going to want it to hook around. Now since we have some lines right here, if we come in sideways and we rotate it down, we want to have it so that it's going just around the cross member and it's not coming in contact with these lines. Now we're going to move down by the leaf springs here and we're going to take our large bail clamp. And this, we're going to start from the back, and we're going to have it going straight forward, and then we're going to rotate it so that the threaded section is going to be facing towards the middle. So once we have it in place, it should be looking like this. We'll just let this sit and rest on the axle for right now. So we're going to start assembling our bag assemblies now. Now on one end of our bag, we're going to have 3 threaded holes, and on the other, we're going to have 2. The one with the 2 is going to be the bottom, so we're going to start by assembling the top area first. We'll grab one of our roll plates. You want to make sure that it sits on the bag so that section is going to sit over it. You don't want to put it on upside down like this. So once we have it pretty close to lined up, we can take our air fitting, and we'll have some thread sealer on there. We want to get this lined up with the center fitting, and we're going to thread it in as tight as we can by hand. And then we're going to come back with a 1/2-inch wrench and we're going to tighten it up 1.5 more turns. So then we're going to grab our upper bracket. Now the way we're going to know if it's the left or right hand side, if we come to this kind of rounded edge here, when we look on the side plate, it'll have an L, so that's going to let us know it's the left-hand side. Now when we go to put it in place, we're going to have this little cutout here. That's going to match up with the fitting, and then these 2 holes on the top will line up with our 2 threaded holes. We can take one of our 3/8 bolts, a lock washer, and a flat washer, and we're going to get these in there just hand tight for right now. We can get them snug, but we really don't want to tighten them down too much. So we're done with the top section, so we're going to flip our bracket over, but since our truck is lifted, we're going to have to put a spacer in. So we're going to grab our lower bracket and the spacer itself. We're going to line up the holes that are in the spacer and the 2 holes that are in the bracket. We'll take one of the 3/8 bolts out of the kit for our spacer and a flat washer, and we're going to go through the spacer and drop it through the lower bracket as well. And then on the bottom side, we'll secure it with a flat washer, and then we'll secure it down with a lock nut. Now we're going to do that for both sides of the spacer in each one of those holes. So now I'm going to take a 9/16 wrench and a ratcheting wrench, and I'm just going to snug these up. And again, you really don't want to tighten these down a whole lot. You just want them snug to where the bolts are going to engage, but we still have a little bit of movement so we can move our spacer back and forth. So now that our spacer's bolted down, but we still have a little bit of movement in there, we're going to grab our lower roll plate, and that's going to go on to the lower section just like the other one. It's going to have that kind of radius section going towards the bag. But now we're going to take the 3/8 bolts that come with our airbag kit, a lock washer, and a flat washer, and we're going to be coming through the spacer, coming from the inside going out, and we're going to line these up so we can bolt it down to the bag itself. Now if your Titan isn't lifted, you do the same type of process except the spacer wouldn't be here. So we would just be coming through the lower plate going onto that roll plate with the hardware. Now when we go to bolt this in place, you'll see these tabs or ears on the bracket. You want these to be facing away from that curve on the upper bracket. So they're going to be going in like this. So we'll have our roll plate loosely lined up, and then we're just going to get that bolt started. Can be a little bit difficult to get everything lined up, but you just want to try to get that roll plate lined up first, and then get that spacer lined up. And we can put our hardware in and get it threaded on there. So we'll get both of those in place. And since we are using that spacer, the spacer's not slotted, but the bracket is. So we're going to go ahead and tighten the bolts up here and go ahead and snug them down. You're going to want to use a 9/16 wrench or socket. Just make sure they're nice and snug. Now you'll notice that we're on a drive-on lift, so our suspension is where it usually sits when we're driving around. However, to get our airbags in place, we're going to have to let our axle drop down so there's enough room. So we're going to use a jack stand and lift it by the frame so that the suspension can stretch out some. Now if you're not using this setup, you're simply just going to want to lift your truck by the frame itself so that the axle can hang down. You want to get as much stretch out of that rear suspension as you can so we have as much room as we can get putting those bags in place. So we're going to take our airbag assembly, and you want to make sure that this rounded section, that's going to go around the cross member, and our air fitting is going to be facing out or towards the tire. Now getting these in place can be a little bit of a hassle, but you just want to move the brake lines and anything that's in the way so we don't cause any damage when we're moving things around. So you do want to make sure that this tab is going to be on the outside of the frame, and it will help if while you're putting it in, you can kind of compress the bag and kind of maneuver it around a bit, because it is going to be a tight fit, even with the suspension hanging down. But we're going to want to take that J-hook and make sure that it's poking out the bottom of the bracket here on the top. And we're going to try to line up our U-bolt as best we can, but that may be in the way right now. But you can see that we have quite a bit of a gap here, so we're not going to be able to get the U-bolt quite in place. So we're going to have to raise the axle. If you're at home and you're lifted by the frame, you're going to want to put a jack underneath the axle itself and raise it up just to where it's making contact. And then we're going to have our U-bolt come out the two holes on this upper bracket here. So you can see we got that top piece of our bracket going right around our cross member, and the U-bolts coming through on the J-hook, and that U-bolt going around the cross member. Now if you didn't have to, most likely you'll have to move this clamp out of the way to get the bracket in place. But after we get it in place, we're going to have the bolts come through on each side. So you just want to make sure it's lined up on the back and the front, and have that come all the way through and make sure that lower bracket is sitting all the way as far to the outside as we can get it. So now we're going to take a flat washer and go over our U-bolts and then take a lock nut and secure it down. And that's going to be the same combination for each one of the bolts coming out of our upper bracket. We're just going to get these loosely on there just so we don't have to worry about them coming out. And we're going to have the same combination of hardware for the lower clamp going around our leaf springs. That flat washer and then a lock nut. You just want to make sure you put one on the rear as well as the front. We're going to have a tab on the lower bracket that's going to be towards the center. It's going to have a square hole. We're going to want to take one of our carriage bolts. Coming from the top, we'll drop it down, making sure that square engages, and we'll do the same thing for the other side of the bracket. Now with both bolts coming down below the axle here, we're going to take our axle clamp, and it's going to have that little curve in it. I want to make sure that curve is facing up. We're going to slide our bolts through. And then we're going to take a flat washer and a lock nut and secure it down. Again, we're just going to put these on there hand tight so that bracket doesn't fall off. Now on the outside where that flange came to the outside of the frame, it's going to line up with that hole that we removed our factory fifth wheel bolt from. We're going to be replacing it with a flange bolt, but before we put it in, we want to make sure to put a little bit of blue Loctite on the bolt. Just put some on the threads, make sure that hole's lined up. And then we'll get that bolt started. So now we're going to come back with an 18mm socket, and we're just going to snug this up. We really don't want to torque down all the way just yet. That'll make sure that our bracket assembly is going to be in the correct position, and then we aren't going to have any trouble getting that bolt in later. So now those two lower lock nuts, we're going to tighten those up, but we're going to alternate going back and forth so we get an even pressure going up. Again, I'm going to be using a 9/16 socket. Now we're going to move to the clamp that's going to go around our leaf spring here. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to tighten it, alternating between the back one and the front one so we can get an even pressure. Now we can move up top, and we're going to tighten down the hook that's going into the frame. And then we'll alternate tightening those two U-bolt nuts down as well. Now if you remember, we left these bolts loose, attaching our lower bracket to either our bag or the spacer like we have here. Now the reason why is because we want to push the lower section of it close to the inside as we can get it. And those holes are slotted, so we just want to slide that lower section of our bag as far in as we can get it, and then we can come back with either a socket or a wrench and tighten up the hardware. Now if you remember, our upper bracket is also going to be slotted from our bag, so if we need to align it front to back, we can move it a little bit, but ours looks fairly straight, so we're going to lower it down and tighten up the hardware. Now it's going to be easiest to tighten these top mounting bolts using a ratcheting wrench, or if you have an extremely low profile ratchet, you may be able to get it in there. So I'm going to come back with that 18mm socket, and I'm going to torque down that bolt that we took out and replaced for our fifth wheel. Now we're going to come back and torque all of the remaining hardware. This is going to be a little bit of a tight fit, so you might want to kind of thread it in a little bit. And then once we have the bolt coming through the other side, we take another flat washer, put it on the back side, and secure it down with the nylon lock nut. So now I'm going to come back with a 7/16 socket and wrench and tighten that hardware up. And we can get ready to install our air lines. Now the easiest way to do this is going to be one piece, so we're going to have to find the center of it. If we take both ends and run our hand down until we come to the end, this will make sure that we have the center of it and it'll be two even lines. I'm going to take a tubing cutter. I'm going to cut my lines right in half. And the reason why you want to use a tubing cutter and not just a pair of side cutters is it's going to make a nice clean straight cut, and that'll prevent any kind of leaks later on down the road. So we're going to take the cut end of our airline tube and we're going to push it into the air fitting on our airbag. Now you want to make sure you push it all the way in. It'll kind of stop, have a little bit of resistance, and then push it in a little bit further. Give it a quick tug to make sure it locks into place. Now we're going to want to route our airline to wherever we're going to be mounting the inflation valves. For us, we're going to be mounting ours at the very back of our bumper by our license plate. So I'm going to go ahead and run these lines and I'll show you how I routed it. From my airbag, I just ran my airline going along the back side of the frame, making sure to stay above it and away from anything that may move or catch it. Then I dropped it towards the inside of the frame and came right back right by my hitch. Now the other side I did pretty much the same thing, except I just brought it over to this side. So we're going to mount our inflation valves just to the left of the license plate right here. Now it's a good idea to go ahead and reach back and see if there's going to be anything back there, so we don't want to drill through anything important. Now I already double checked and there's no wiring or anything else, so we're going to go ahead and make two holes so we can mount our inflation valves. So we'll go ahead and start one hole. And you're going to want to use a 5/16 drill bit to make sure we can get those inflation valves through. So we made it through the plastic, but there is a metal plate back there, so we're just going to keep drilling until we can go all the way through. So now that we have one hole drilled, we're going to drill another one. You just want to move over just enough to where you have space for two valves there. So we already have our holes drilled, and we went ahead and put one of the fittings in place. But we'll go over the hardware that you're going to use to get them in. So we'll take our airline fitting, we'll take one of the hex nuts, and we're going to thread it all the way down to the bottom. Then we're going to take the star washer and slide it over. Then we can take our fitting and come from behind and push it through. Then we're going to follow it up with a rubber washer. This is going to be a little bit of a tight fit. I'm just going to push it on there as far as it'll go on by hand. I'll follow up that rubber washer with a flat washer, and then another hex nut. So then I'm going to come back with a 1/2 inch socket. I'm going to snug up both of the nuts. You don't want to go crazy tight, you just want them to be nice and snug so it'll draw enough of that fitting out so that we can get an air chuck on it. With those snug, we'll go ahead and put the caps on. We're going to tie up the excess air lines behind the bumper so we don't have to worry about it interfering with our spare tire or anything else when we're driving down the road. So with everything tidied up, I'm going to go ahead and take the caps off. We're going to put a little bit of air in each one of our bags. That way we can check for leaks on either side of the system. So I'm going to take a little bit of soapy water. I'm going to spray down all the fittings and the bag. And what we're going to be looking for is for bubbles. The little bubbles are okay because that's naturally going to happen with soap. But what we're looking for is a bunch of bigger bubbles that are expanding and then eventually popping. That way we know that there's air escaping. So we're going to spray down the rest of the system and check for any leaks. That'll finish up your look at the Air Lift Loadlifter 5000 helper springs for the rear axle, part number AL88229 on our 2016 Nissan Titan.